panel. And Congressman Khanna, I want to start with you because you heard your colleague Elaine Luria talking. It's not just House Democrats who are apparently frustrated with the DOJ. The New York Times reports that President Biden told his inner circle that he thinks Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and should be prosecuted. Here's a quote from the paper. And while the president has never communicated his frustrations directly to Mr. Garland, he has said privately that he wanted Mr. Garland to act less like a ponderous judge and more like a prosecutor who is willing to take decisive action over the events of January 6th.
I have great respect and admiration for the Attorney General. We campaigned for 4 years saying we were going to be the party that upholds the rule of law, that's going to have an independent Justice Department. We need to stick to that, and I believe he will look where the facts go.
Congressman Jane Harman.
I totally agree with that. And I think he's an excellent lawyer. And he had a press conference about 3 or 6 months ago saying he was going to build up from the bottom, and he's doing that extremely effectively. And I predict he's going to act. I think there's lots of information coming out finally now. And I think he will act by summer.
As a huge supporter of all of these investigations, I do think it's extremely dangerous for Joe Biden to put his hand on the scale.
Of course.
If there's any perception of the White House saying you need to prosecute the former president without clearly laying out the case, just kind of saying, well, I think he did bad things. And here's the big problem when it comes to January 6th. It is so complicated and so overreaching that no one can really get their hands around it. So instead of complaining that the Justice Department isn't moving quick enough, which I do want to see an answer on the contempt charge for Mark Meadows, someone needs to explain the story, how this moved from the conspiracies that President Trump laid out to the failed legal strategy that should have stopped them in their tracks when it came to certification, to how that morphed to a political strategy by the White House and certain members of Congress, and then finally the physical, the violence that happened. Because this is an escalating story, and that narrative needs to be told.
Look, if it's true and the president is pressuring Merrick Garland, even obliquely, it's shameful, shouldn't do it. And look, I think the American people are going to be the ultimate judge here. And if you look at polling, they don't care. You know what the American people care about? They care about 40% high inflation rates. So they care about $6 gas. That's what they care about. Yep. When congressmen here go back to campaign this fall,
not directly pressuring, but
the story's out there.
But the story, but Congresswoman, you've seen movies like this before. Exactly.
But the narrative is out there, and I think people are learning about it. I agree, it's not going to move the needle on the election, but it should move the needle in terms of ability to protect our democracy in the future. The Election Security Act and the other things we're now talking about are crucial if we want to save our democracy. And, oh, by the way, we'll talk later, but I think we ought to worry about our world order after Ukraine. We need a day-after strategy to put the world back together.
And it ought to be bipartisan. I respect your service to our country and the military. I mean, wouldn't you want people prosecuted who attacked the Capitol?
Congressman, when you break the law, you should be prosecuted. Right. You break the law, you should be prosecuted. There's no dispute about that, right? But I think that this January 6th panel has taken longer longer than the Kennedy assassination investigation, longer than 9/11 investigation, right? Let's get it wrapped up. Let's get it wrapped up.
9/11 investigation had a commission.
A little over a year.
They don't have the same tools.
This is the largest federal investigation that this nation has ever seen, with more than 700 people physically arrested.
If it wasn't political, the results wouldn't be coming out in September and October this year.
Oh, that is... Testified to the January 6th
that's your answer.
So that's stonewalling from the top officials who won't tell what actually happened that day.
If we had a January 6th commission, which was the right answer, we would be much farther along.
And you know what? The speaker should have allowed Republicans to participate fully, and we would have been there, and it would have had much more credibility.
David, you talked about what voters care about. So let's talk a bit about that and about the fact that it's hard to believe. Election Day is about 7 months from now. You are the one person here who's going to be on the ballot. So talk about what David said about gas prices, about inflation, and that up against the fact that the numbers job growth, wage growth are pretty good. But is that what you're hearing from constituents?
Absolutely. Well, let's start with the facts. It's been record job creation. These aren't just low-paying jobs. These are good-paying jobs. Look at what's happening in Ohio. I mean, President Trump talked about revitalizing the Midwest. President Biden is delivering $20 billion, 7,000 manufacturing jobs, 3,000 construction jobs. Of course, people are hurting with gas prices. The president is releasing 180 million barrels of oil. We're talking about buying back into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to increase short-term production. That is going to address that. I'm open to a federal gas tax holiday. I'm open to the states doing that. We're doing everything we can to lower prices.
But here's the problem for President Biden is that he has done a lot of things, starting with the massive, child care tax credit, talking about releasing oil, the infrastructure bill. But voters aren't giving him any credit for that. He has very low approval ratings. And so that is a fundamental problem there. If Biden is doing all that he can, throwing money, pouring stimulus money into the economy, and voters don't like that. And it's actually causing inflation.
You said that discussion. Yeah, and you said that's true. Why?
Well, I don't know. We've lost the narrative. I think if Joe Biden had talked from day one about bread and butter issues, we'd be much farther along. Congress got bogged down. Boo on Congress. Just saying, Ro. In terms of passing major legislation.
Someone who knows.
Sit closer. Come on over. It's not that bad on the side.
Congress got bogged down. But again, the message was how big these bills were, not what they would do. And politics now requires, I think, a building from the ground up and telling the right story about what he is doing to conceive Trump tax cuts, in my view, and what he's doing about drug prices and the things that will really matter to average people. And if that narrative gets out, 6 months is 6 years in politics, let's all understand that, then I think those numbers will change.
Yeah, but that's not the narrative. The narrative is crisis at the border, surging gas prices, inflation, energy independent as a nation. Right? Those things, that's what Americans see. That's what resonates with Americans. And that's why, unfortunately, for the congressman, his party's going to be in the minority in a big way after this next election.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that the narrative for the president is he's the first person who actually wants to build this country. He's talking about good-paying jobs. He's delivering on good-paying jobs. He's got an economic message. Now, let's talk about the vote we just had in the House of Representatives. Every Democrat voted to say insulin shouldn't be more than $35. Why are the Republicans not for that? And then the Republicans are talking about let's take health care insurance away. If the Republicans are in charge, let's be clear, 15 million people will lose their health insurance because they don't want the Medicaid extensions. So these are the issues that we ought to be talking about.
But Congressman, for some reason, your party's better figure it out quickly, because you're going to lose a bunch of seats. That's not sticking.
But let's be realistic about what's going on. The president has had a very tough hand. I mean, we've got who's invaded a sovereign country. We've had COVID with Omicron and Delta. And I don't doubt that people are frustrated. But you know why they're frustrated? Because the country is going through tough times.
But what happened to that sign? The buck stops here. Right? What happened to that sign on the desk?
Yes.
Right?
I think we want the president's empathy. We want his leadership. And I think people realize he's trying to do the right thing. He wants to bring this country together. I think at the end of the day, they're going to look at the alternative, a party where you're going to have Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert in charge, and they're going to say no.
He mentioned immigration. There were changes this week. Congresswoman,
That's right. Title 42 is changing because the CDC has said there's no longer the threat of COVID.
And on the raw politics, how
the raw politics
problematic
are really tough. I mean, really, really tough.
I saw Senator Hassan and somebody else earlier on this network.
We're going to have to deploy a lot more folks to the border to make sure that the proper asylum claims are processed quickly and the right people get into the country. But we are an open country. The history of America is refugees and immigrants, like I'm sure your family, my family, your family, many families who build this country to the great country that it is. And we can't just close down. And that wall has been ineffective in addition to very expensive. Let's understand that. And it sends exactly the wrong message for America.
But Biden is walking into a self-manufactured crisis by rescinding that rule without having any kind of blueprint in place. And we're looking at apprehensions of 7,000 people a day going into the summer. That is unacceptable.
And it's also going to allow Ukrainian refugees in who are stranded in Mexico.
That is a completely separate issue.
No, there are many. There are thousands in Mexico.
The process for asylees follows the process. Running over the border and disobeying our laws is not the process.
To George Bush 43's credit, he proposed a comprehensive immigration reform bill, which I support.
Let's end there on a reminder that there was a time when people worked together on this issue. Thank you for the robust
agreed on so many things.
discussion. Thank you all for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
She's using an air raid siren app on her phone to keep tabs on her 2-year-old son in Ukraine. What is so important for this mother and Ukrainian politician to leave her son behind and travel to Washington? She'll tell you next.